one of the Battle of Russia, you saw the Russian people's historic defense against centuries of unsuccessful invasion.
This is a film about that scale and grandeur. This is a film about that military achievement. This is a film about a people that for all time shattered the legend of Nazi invincibility.
And how, in spite of Hitler's prediction,
This is a film about victory and defeat.
the swastika would fly over the Kremlin tower.
German victory.
December had come, but it wasn't the swastika
German
that ruled the
defeat.
Russian capital, and it wasn't the clumsy conquerors marching through the streets of the
This is the battle for
fresh
Russia.
reserves of the Red Army.
A battle that has been going on for
and
centuries.
relieve the front
A
line.
battle that fills the pages of Russian history. 1242. The German Order of Teutonic Knights had invaded northeastern Russia and occupied the old city of Pskov. They remembered that in their past history, the time always came when they could turn and strike back. The time had come. Their old ally, the Russians, under the leadership of their Grand Master, von Bock, they threatened to enslave the whole population of that area, including the capital, Novgorod. And while in the churches of Russia, the men of God prayed for victory against the invaders. In their hour of peril, the Russian people turned for leadership to their prince, Alexander Nevsky. And on April the 5th, 1242, on Lake Peipus, the Russians met the might of the German forces. In the front lines, the men of the Red Army listened to the long-awaited order to the red. The whole world is looking to you to destroy the German horde. The war you are fighting is a war of liberation, a just war. Yes, the German invaders weren't as well equipped or as well organized. Fighter command ready. Power command ready. But in their hearts was a flaming courage. Artillery. A flame so fierce that it pierced the German army. Cavalry in position. Infantry ready. The victory they won fills a bright page of Russian history. 1704. And another conquering army marched across Russian land. This time under Charles XII of Sweden. And again the Russians fought for their country. Led by their Emperor Peter the Great, after 5 long years of war, they defeated the Swedes in the historic Battle of Poltava. The invading Swedish armies were crushed and forever driven out of Russia. 1812. Napoleon and his armies had blazed their triumphant way across Europe and were marching on Moscow. The conquering armies entered the city, but they entered a city in flames. Even in that day, Russia learned that the scorched earth would invade. And once again, the invader was forced to start the long march on the road back out of Russia. 1914, and another German army, this time under Kaiser Wilhelm, set out to conquer Russia. This time, the Russian people, under the regime of the Tsar, were not only fighting German turn to fight for their lives, but oppression and corruption in their own country. And only the ultimate collapse of Imperial Germany saved Russia from losing from the German armies that retreated and the Crimea, which the Germans occupied in 1918. Yes, for 700 years, the Russian people have had to fight to defend their land against would-be conquerors. Why? Why have all these attempts been made to conquer Russia? Perhaps Russia itself can provide the answer. Here it is, one picture the Earth's surface, reaching from east to west nearly halfway around the world, southward from the North Pole to the borders of India. One country of 9 million square miles. Village after village, town after town, along the Red Army swept through the country which for days and weeks had been under the invaders' yoke. When it is dusk on its western borders facing Europe, it is already dawn on its eastern borders facing the Pacific. That's Russia, or to be correct, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Deep in its mountains lie thick, rich veins of gold and silver. Below ground lie enormous deposits of copper, tin, manganese and nickel, chromium and radium, sulfur and magnesium. Russia is rich in raw materials. Her forests cover millions upon millions of acres. 1/4 of all the lumber reserve in the world belongs to Russia. And as for fuel, it is coal, ton upon ton. And more important is also oil. 213 million barrels a year of it. Black gold flowing from the earth that contains 55% of the world's oil. What else? Iron? Russia has better than 10 million tons. That can make a lot of steel before it's done. Yes, Russia is rich. It covers millions upon millions of acres. The rich black earth that besides giving forth oil and coal will also grow everything from sunflowers to locusts. The tea her people drink in such huge quantities, and the tobacco that they smoke out of the cellars, cotton grows here too. 3,800,000 bales a year. Come the men sugar. And the women and the children. And on the pasture land, the animals grow fat for food. And wool for clothes. Find wives and mothers. While on the warm plains, the fields of grain stretch as far as the eye can reach. There is corn, oats, hops, rye, and don't forget wheat. There is also 1/3 of the world's best. They will never forget. Yes, Russia is very rich. The shattered for it has not only raw materials and the products of its soil. Russia is also people. They stand shattered now, ghostly relics of what they once have been. Nothing has been spared. 193 million people. People of every race, color, and creed. People coming from the many different republics that comprise the Soviet Union. People speaking more than 100 different languages, but all citizens of one country. Whether they are the great Russians, the descendants of the first settlers of this vast area, and for 1,000 years its main population, or Cossacks, the famous horsemen from the open plains of the Don River Valley. It is worth more and all is and all the inspiration. Only one. Whether they come from the southwest, the Ukraine, here in the breadbasket of the Soviet Union lives the Little Russians, better known as Ukrainians, and beside them the Moldavians and Bessarabia. Or if they come from the far south, between the Caspian and Black Sea, buried nearby had read his famous book, they would have learned their fate beforehand. There were other dead the Nazis didn't have. Russian dead. Where we find the Armenians and the Georgians. They weren't soldiers, the English, the Cherkasses, rugged as the high peaks of their native Caucasian mountains. Whether they are Uzbeks, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, from the Persian and Indian frontiers, Mongols. The Bashkirs, the Turco-Tartars, the Buryats, the Yakuts from far beyond the Ural Mountains. And there were other children. Or the people of the ice country, hunters like the Zauns, young girls, or settlers like the Laplanders. The attentions of the Nazi soldiers aged them very quickly. Whether they come from the pioneering wilderness of the far north, the invaders, or from a great city like their capital, Moscow, where the ancient buildings of an ancient civilization stand beside the modern structures of a modern civilization. These are the things where the old Russian droshka still competes with the modern limousine. These are the reasons why every Russian pledged his life to uphold this sacred oath. Whether they work in factories or as soldiers, whether they are bricklayers or traffic cops, sailors or riveters, school children or farmers, nurses or engineers, window washers or sales girls, housewives or postal clerks, radio announcers or stewardesses, scientists or typists, musicians or ballerinas. Blood for blood, death regardless of what they do or where they live. They all have one thing in common: love of their soil. That is the reason the Russians smashed on deeper and deeper. That is Russia. Along the entire front side, Rostov to Leningrad, the largest country in the world. Nowhere could the tide of Russian raw materials stop. Unlimited. By spring of 1942, manpower, 193 million from the Germans. These are the three reasons why every conqueror in history has wanted Russia. Not that this, and these are the reasons why the modern would-be conqueror wrote the whole legend
when
of
we speak of
Nazi
new territory,
invincibility has
we
been
must think of
shattered.
Russia.
German armies
points
could
the way
retreat
there.
too. German armies yes, could be defeated. As we have seen, Germany's spirit of aggression was handed down from generation to generation. And now, in Hitler's Germany, the dream was world conquest. For such a dream, there could be only one answer: collective security. So with this objective, in 1934, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations. Again and again before the League, its representatives urged binding agreements to support by collective action any nation submitted to attack. A city now called Leningrad after the leader of the Russian Revolution,
the maintenance
and
of
which
indivisible
before
peace.
that,
The League of Nations is still strong
in
enough
honor of its
by
founder,
collective action
Peter the Great.
to avert or
A city
arrest
which
aggression.
today, with the exception
There is no
of
room
Moscow,
for bargaining
is the
or
most
compromise.
important center. But while some members of the League were pleading vainly for the use of collective force to stop aggression, and also the world saw other members, Germany, Italy, and Japan, withdraw from the League to follow the path of aggression. On June 22nd, word came of the attack. But here, the city was only a few miles then from Hitler invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and in 1939, and while the men of the Red Army and the Baltic Fleet on the road to meet the enemy, but as eastward behind them another army was formed. By France, an army used weapons with shovels instead of rifles. War. An army of men. So the Germans were forced to turn west. Women. And in 1940, as we have seen, wiped the last opposition from Western Europe. Threw up barricades. And while the Nazis were unsuccessfully trying to beat Britain to her knees, prepared themselves for the German generals were already planning to resume in the front line. Eastern Blitz. They weren't wrong. The road to Russia is now open. But before that attack, preliminary steps were necessary. South and east of Germany are Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Greece. And Hungary had grain, rich fields of it. Grain too good for Hungarians when German soldiers have such good appetites. Hungary had bauxite. Bauxite makes aluminum, and aluminum makes planes. And Hungary had an army. Not the battle-trained German army, but good enough to throw against Russian guns. Romania had not only grain, but oil. And Hitler needed metropolis, the power of the war. Romania also had more slave labor, more cannon fodder, and most important, Romania and Hungary both had Russian frontiers. And yet there weren't those frontiers in the hands of German generals. Bulgaria didn't have a Russian frontier, but it did have bases. Bases on the
Leningrad's baptism of fire didn't stop
German submarines prey on Russian ships. By the spring of 1941, the reactionary government of Hungary, under the dictatorship of Admiral Horthy, of Romania, governed by young King Michael, who was only a tool in the hands of Hitler's puppet, General Antonescu, and of Bulgaria, ruled by King Boris, always a disciple of German imperialism. All sold their countries out to Hitler. Now, crushed by a revolt of their people, they were only too glad to be protected by Hitler's army. So by March of 1941, German armies were in occupation of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. That still left Yugoslavia and Greece. So long as they remained unoccupied territory, they remained the route for a possible Allied
Finally, the
counter-invasion.
morning comes.
At one of
And
their
the
regular
people of
meetings, Hitler
Leningrad
had assigned the job of
dig
conquering
themselves out
Greece
from
to his stooge, Mussolini. The stooge was delighted. Here was his chance to prove to his people that he too was a conqueror. But he was wrong. Perhaps the uniforms fooled him. Something did. For after the fascist legions had blitzed on one cylinder this far into Greece, the Greeks, in a brilliantly conducted mountain campaign, drove the Italians back and invaded Albania. Hitler was enraged.
As in those
The failure of his
cities,
stooge to
homes,
protect his southern flank was delaying the attack on Russia.
military objectives.
He sent a final ultimatum.
Like the Russian Dumbo.
For the Yugoslavs and Greeks, it was surrender
one
or else.
important difference.
But the Yugoslavs and
the
Greeks
air was
come
only
from a
one
long
small
line of
part
fighting men.
What the people of
Nazi
Leningrad
slavery
had to
didn't
face.
appeal to them.
In September, the Nazis surrounded them. The announcement cut off the city an ultimatum demanding his surrender.
Still waiting for the answer.
Thus began the siege of
At
Leningrad.
dawn, on April 6th,
The last
German bombs told the Yugoslavians they were at war with Germany.
Everywhere else in Russia.
The Nazis and Italians launched a powerful and coordinated attack from all their bases, supported by virtually unopposed aerial
But here,
bombardment.
unlike everywhere else
The
in Russia,
conclusion was
the
inevitable.
winter wasn't an ally.
Although resistance was
but an enemy.
determined, the Yugoslav army
Here,
was
the
cut
10,
up into
20,
many small
30 below
segments
zero
and captured.
temperatures could only mean
The war in
suffering.
Greece also began on
hardship.
April 6th.
In the
There,
trenches
despite a
outside
fierce
the
and
city,
valiant resistance by the Greeks
snow and the
and the British who had come to their aid,
stuck firm to their
the
oath.
Germans, overwhelmingly superior in both numbers and
Not to go
equipment,
backwards one
forced their way
step.
past the
And the
Bistrica
enemy,
River,
in spite of all
Mount
efforts,
Olympus,
was stopped at
the
the very
famous
gates
passage
of
of
the city.
Thermopylae.
The city
And
now
by the end of
faced
April, the
siege,
swastika flew over the
famine,
ancient city of Athens.
destitution.
The conquest of the Balkans was now complete.
There was no oil.
The whole
for
force
fuel.
of Nazi might could now be
No
turned
power
loose on
to
Russia.
electrify.
There was no
People
time to
defied
wait,
the elements.
for time was
the
Russia's
necessary
weapon.
miles to lay
Their industries, so recently built and which, like our own, were designed for the ways of peace, were converted for war. Instead of steel for plows and tools, steel for shells and guns. They knew their industry could never produce enough to equip them adequately for the titanic struggle. But what they could produce, they would. At the same time, the army began to grow.
Everyone else,
More and more men were called up to be trained, hardened, drilled, prepared to defend their land.
An army of women working with shovels, working with
With the conquest of the Balkans, the Nazis had a solid front from the Black Sea to the Balkans. But the Russians had built themselves a buffer
Bombs
to
from
take
the
some
air
of the
could
steam out of
force
the
the
Nazi
defenders
punch,
of
no matter
Leningrad
where
to
it
surrender.
landed. But where would it
Winter
land?
could
When the blow
Hunger
came,
could
it was from 5 different directions.
So the Germans
And from the north, one exit,
surrender.
just for lunch. That was the big day.
For days, long-range guns hurled ton after
As
ton
dawn
of high
broke, nearly
explosives
200 Axis
into the
divisions,
heart of the city.
more than 2 million men, fronted for 20,000 miles long, reaching from the in the flank. Their aim was annihilation of the Red Army. The present battle on the frontier. The offensive started along the whole length of the front. It was concentrated on three main objectives. The more the people of Leningrad were shelled, Moscow, the harder they worked. Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine. In the first 30 days, von Lee's forces rose within 125 miles of Leningrad, while the Finns overran, supported by the Germans, began advancing to the north in search of the city. In the center, Moscow was 480 miles of Soviet territory. One Russian city after the other was overrun by the invaders. Drenched in a rain of high explosives, cut off entirely from the rest of Russia, with only their own hands to depend on. Their determination never faltered. And on July 17th, more people died. The first main objective, Smolensk, regarded as the key to Moscow. Simultaneously in the south, von Rundstedt's forces cut deep into the Ukraine in its darkest hour. This was blitzkrieg at its best. The world gave Russia another 6 weeks. A miracle happened. And the Germans issued a communique. Leningrad is the Baltic Sea.
The issue in the east has already been settled.
7,000 square miles of inland water. But then a strange thing happened. For the first time since the mighty German army started its career of blitz, smashing into submission one European country after the other, that same German army came up against a country that was nearly 100 miles that did not submit. Despite the fact that Hitler's army swept deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union, and by October the 15th stood practically within the shadows of the Kremlin, despite the fact that the Soviet government and all foreign missions were forced to move to Kuibyshev 700 miles to the east, despite Hitler's triumphant pronouncement, I can pray that this enemy is already broken and will never rise again. Sledges, carving the road by December 500,000 square miles of Russian territory, an area equal to the entire soon across this highway, from the far side of the lake, poured a stream of trucks. Despite Russia's loss of her best agricultural areas, her most fully developed industrial plants, grain, millions of her people, truckload after truckload of fresh light, despite every people of the city. Those 6 weeks had lengthened into nearly 6 months. But too late, the Germans discovered that they had left one avenue of rescue open and finally died. What had happened? Let's try to analyze it. First, in this titanic struggle, not only two armies, but the method, two strategies came face to face. The German strategy was based on the well-tried one wedge would be driven deep into the enemy territory. Planes bombed the road with another spearhead, the trucks kept rolling. By day, and by night, the victim would be pocketed for annihilation. The German plan in every campaign reached the city to seek, but the Russians were now laying a invasion across the ice.
A single blow must destroy the enemy without regard for losses. A gigantic, all-destroying blow.
To the heroes of Leningrad was the inscription. Remember the campaigns you have already seen in these pioneer voyage. Poland, from the far shore of the lake, concentrated on their borders. Medicine, the blitz broke supplies of all kinds. 18 days finished Poland. Across the lake. And into Leningrad. The Allied strength on the border, the first of many. The breakthrough trains that not only brought in supplies, but could take out the wounded, the sick women, the Yugoslavians rushed to the border. The breakthrough came, and in 12 days, all those that needed better care. The Germans planned the same blitz against the Russians. Lake traffic continued. But the Russians had developed their own strategy. One state full advantage of the vast area of their land. Outside the Russian strategy found the strength not only to defend, line after line, attack, far back into the interior. Time after time, they hurled themselves against the invader, driving him inch by inch back from the city's outskirts. Again, the wedge would strike. Again, the second. But again, the line would bend until it became part of the third. So the deeper the Germans plowed into Russian soil, the stronger their opposition, until finally they faced an unshakable wall and were robbed of their chance to hit that all-destroying blow they had counted on. You've evidence of Russian tenacity. The Germans conquered land and lost the
warm
campaign.
breath of spring is
But the
felt,
Russian
too, on
tactics kept the main bulk of their armies intact and made a long war inevitable instead of that quick decision the Germans sought. And the Russians had other tactics that threw the Germans for a loss. Germany had developed blitzkrieg warfare, mechanized
Spring
warfare,
as it invariably
armies
does,
on wheels,
comes to the fifth.
juggernauts to crush everything before them. But the Russians found a way to drag them out of their traveling fortress. They used their cities as strongholds and made the breeze come to them down alley. For the first time in months, the trolleys ran. The more a city was bombed, the more impassable it became for the German that every man and woman and child and they made the names of these Russian cities as familiar to us as the names of towns in the next county. Rostov, this Kharkov, Kiev, Light for the Leningrad children. City after city standing in the path of the Nazi blitz. Light for the Red Army found a way to make their cities of great strategic importance. And for the Russian wave, Odessa, women of the Red Sea, scene of an heroic siege of more than 2 months. The arcs held up the whole Nazi front into the Crimea.
Sevastopol resisted every attempt of the Germans to break through. Here, for 8.5 long months, the Russians fought for the town, inch by inch, barring the Germans from the great Black Sea naval base located there. And finally, when the Germans entered the town, each district was defended street by street. Each street, house by house. Spring is here. Summer is coming. Leningrad is still free. Although some Germans did finally succeed in getting each house, room by room. But under different circumstances than they had anticipated. The Russians knew their cities would be demolished, but their objective was not to save cities, but to destroy Germans.
Courage of a determined
high price to pay for a copy of
citizens of Leningrad have proved
so the Germans were
generals
forced out
may
of their
win
armored
campaigns,
to fight,
but people win
to
war.
die in the hand-to-hand combat they thought they had abolished. There was another item the Germans had overlooked.
They overlooked
By summer
people.
of 1942,
And
new
generals
posters
may
were
win
appearing in the
campaigns,
streets of Moscow.
but people
Posters
win
that
war.
greeted and welcomed their allies.
And on that fatal
Allies
June
whose help was
22nd,
already arriving in
when the
Russian
Russian
ports.
people first learned of the invasion of their country,
Allies whose
grim
friendliness
faces
had sent
told of their
drugs and
determination.
food and warm
Fight
clothing to help sustain
die.
them in their darkest hour.
never surrender.
But in spite of all this,
They knew
the staff
this
of the Red
wasn't a
Army
question
knew
of
that
who
they still
occupied what
faced the
piece
most
of
powerful
land.
enemy in history,
This was
and
a
that
question
enemy
of
would
life
attack again.
or death.
But when this attack came, the whole German strength was to be concentrated on one objective:
It is the war
the
of
Caucasus
the entire Russian
and
people.
oil.
Not
The
only to
Caucasus
eliminate
Mountains
the
represent
danger
one of the
hanging
toughest
over our
military
heads,
obstacles in the
but
world,
to aid all people
towering
groaning
peaks
under
rising
the
to heights
yoke
of as much as
fascism.
18,000 feet.
So the
With only
alarm
one
was spread
practical
to
highway
factory and
traversing it.
farm.
And Baku,
From every
the
Russian
biggest oil
town and
field, is on
village,
the other
men
side.
poured forth to answer the
To
call.
reach Baku, the only feasible military route was along the
From
coast
now
of
on,
the
one
Caspian
thing
Sea.
mattered and one thing
The
only.
map showed what a dangerously
Victory.
extended supply line
Total
this
war
would
meant
entail.
total
To
mobilization.
make the operation a
Not
success
war
for the
just for
Germans,
soldiers.
the first necessity
War
was
for
control of the
everyone.
northern hub of the rail lines
Young
of the
or
area,
old,
and a new
male or
base of
female,
operations.
made
That
no
hub
difference.
was above the river port
Age
we have
had
come to
nothing
know
to do
well,
with it.
Stalingrad.
You were only 12 years
Named
old
for
it was
Russia's
work
present
for
leader.
12-year-olds to do.
The pride of this
Sex
generation
had
of
nothing to do
Russians,
with it.
for it
If
was
you could
their
hold a
city,
rifle,
built in
you were
their
a soldier.
time.
If you could turn a lathe,
With the
you were a
capture of
soldier.
Stalingrad, the
If you
Nazis
could
would
harvest
have a
the
base
fields,
from
you
which
were
to
a
launch
soldier.
a flanking attack
If
on
you could
Moscow.
handle a locomotive or pilot
With
a
one
ship,
master stroke,
or
the
guide
Russian
a
armies
tractor,
to the south would be
you
cut
were
off
still
from
a
help.
soldier.
And in the north,
For
Russian
everything you
factories,
did was part
Russian
of that
farms,
total war.
and Russian army.
Nothing that the enemy could
Practically
use
cut off
was left
Caucasus
behind.
oil.
Not a
Also
yard of
from
wire
American and
or a
British
pound of
supplies,
iron.
which
Not
were
an
shipped to
acre of
Russia
wheat
through
or a head
Iran
of
and
cattle.
Iraq.
And the
German
old men
control of the
stood watch
Empress
over the
Revolta
field,
and its two main forts,
ready to give the word to burn the first sight of
would
the
be a
enemy.
crippling blow for Russia. For the Volga is the vital artery through which flowed the
What
lifeblood of
can't be
supply.
withdrawn was destroyed. Early in May, the German offensive began along a front extending from Kursk to the Crimea.
Flames flamed them all.
Within 2 weeks, the Nazi steamroller had overrun the Kerch poured not only 2 months more which will lapse before 5 long years finally fell, giving the Nazis complete control of the miracle of electricity and the southern route to the Caucasian oil fields. Next, they started to drive further north, power it generated through to the Don River in the area of Bryan, then spread southeast until they occupied the whole area of the Don River south of the land they had lived on. This left them in perfect position to strike against Stalingrad. Their field. Further and further south, the drive plunged on. By the end of August, they had captured the oil fields of Macon, the invaders. Needless to say, first demolished by the Russian scorched earth, and reached the northern Caucasus.
Yes, the Germans were only a few miles from their goal, the oil fields at Baku.
An army without
But 2 barriers still stood between
home was the forest.
Russian mountains,
Whose front was
Russian
the enemy's
determination.
rear.
The people of the Caucasus joined with the army to form an unshatterable wall
maximum of
against the
determination.
full onslaught of the attack.
Their achievements were seldom reported. Look well at these faces.
Further north,
never
the Nazi
see them again
again
in the
within
ranks of
15
war
miles of
prisoners.
Stalingrad.
Or read their names
This
over
city has
heroes'
become
graves.
the focal point of the whole campaign.
Ahead of them lay nothing but the rope and the hall.
Regardless of the
Stayed
cost,
behind and went on
Stalingrad
fighting.
must be captured.
Their only
Those
goal
were the German
was
orders.
destruction. Destruction of communication.
German guns,
The invaders
German
themselves.
bombs shattered the city into
Their
pieces.
weapons were dynamite. The terror of surprise. Last for no mercy, they gave.
By September 20th, Germans, after 30 days of grueling and ceaseless fight, scorched earth, battled their way into the city's outskirts. These its leaders. These are the reasons why, although the Germans conquered land, by the end of the month, their drive had carried them through the whole northwest section of the city, just land, and into occupation of part of the scorched land, including the railroad
These
station.
are the reasons why, after 5.5
On the last
months
day of
of
September,
Blitz war,
Hitler announced that the fall
After
of the
coming
city
within
was only
sight
a
of
matter
their
of a
goal,
few days.
the
Once
Germans
more,
were
the world was
stopped at the
afraid
very
the
gates
Russian
of Moscow.
campaign was lost.
These are the reasons
Once
why,
more, the Germans
although
would
Hitler had
stand on the
sworn
very
that before
threshold of
December the
victory.
swastika would fly from
Still
the Kremlin
failed.
towers. December had come.
And now they were to meet a fire of fury such as they had never known.
It wasn't the Nazi conquerors who marched through the streets. The French reserves of the Red Army.
All that had gone before, the battles waged in the streets of Kiev, Rostov, Odessa, Sevastopol, these were all preludes to what happened in Stalingrad. Every inch of the city was a strategic point to be defended as such. By the end of October, snow covered Stalingrad. From the air, the Germans tried to force the surrender of the Russian-held part of the city. At the same time, the battle of the streets continued.
as November dawned, the Russians were no longer defending their city inch by inch. Inch by inch, they were regaining it. Now, as the whole world spoke in admiration of the city of steel, the ticker tape brought us breathtaking news. American and British troops had landed in and occupied North Africa. Further east, the British Eighth Army was driving westward, pursuing the vaunted Africa Corps. And in the northeast, the Red Army had launched its smashing counteroffensive. The Germans were learning the real meaning of the word combined operations. As though a spring had been released, the Russians attacked along the entire front. In the far north, the Germans felt the first impacts. The Russians recaptured Schlüsselburg, breaking the Axis ring around Leningrad. Soon after, another offensive lashed out further south, bypassing the Germans' defense position of Rzhev and plunging down to Veliki Luki. Still another Russian blow fell in the Voronezh area, pushing a threatening spearhead deep into the German lines. In the far south, the Germans were moving away from Grozny instead of toward it, under the force of the Russian attack. At Stalingrad, the Germans were about to meet new opponents. Fresh reserves were arriving from far Siberia. They had been stationed there in case of trouble with the Japanese. Now these troops had been transported to relieve the embattled defenders of Stalingrad. And as the reserves entered the city, at headquarters, the commanders of three Russian armies were meeting. The Germans had fought for Stalingrad as a prize. The Russians were determined to make it a trap. Two simultaneous attacks were launched, one from the north, one from the south. The German armies encircling Stalingrad were now themselves threatened with encirclement. Finally, the two prongs met. These battle-hardened soldiers of the Northern Army and soldiers of the Southern were emotional as children as they greeted each other. They knew this meeting meant the salvation of Stalingrad and of their country. And on this Christmas of 1942, the people of the Soviet Union can celebrate with happy hearts. They have received a most precious gift from the men of their army, the assurance of ultimate victory. Just as in our hometowns, it is the Children's Day in Moscow. It is a happier Christmas this year. Today, there are no German bombers overhead. In other years, the Russians, like ourselves, celebrated on New Year's Eve, but not now. The factories are just as busy as on any other night. The moment comes. It is the New Year.
З Новим годом!
And at the front, the greeting is the same, up to a point.
С Новым годом, гвардейцы! Огонь!
Inside Stalingrad, the icy winter becomes a fiery hell. Here are concentrated the latest in Russian equipment. Flamethrowers, ice gliders, used here by shock troops to capture airfields in advance of the main army. Rocket guns, Katyusha, the Russians call them. Every last resource of the Red Army was thrown into a crushing offense of ultimate destruction.
This was Kyle and Kessel with a vengeance, but the Nazis were getting Kessel instead of the Russians. And on February the 2nd, 1943, after 162 days of the heaviest fighting in the history of warfare, the last shot was fired. Peace came to Stalingrad. In the shattered streets, the blasted ruins, the ghastly evidence of their ordeal, the defenders of the city greet the rescuing army of the dawn. Stalingrad is free. The Nazis had capitulated. The German generals who had been ordered by Hitler to take Stalingrad regardless of the cost, and who had obediently promised that the city would be his, these generals, 24 of them, who had covered themselves with such glory and such medals on the fields of Poland and Norway and France, they now had only their past glory to comfort. This is Field Marshal von Paulus, Commander-in-Chief of the German armies at Stalingrad. This is the man who told his soldiers that if they surrendered, he would see to it that their families died in reprisal. When he faced his captors, perhaps his worried expression reflected an anxiety that Hitler might take the same revenge on his family. For he knew that when he surrendered, Hitler lost not only a field marshal, he lost an entire army, 22 divisions, 330,000 men.
These are the men who had been promised that as conquerors they would winter in Stalingrad. Well, it was winter, and this was Stalingrad. Here were the conquerors. And when another spring broke over the Russian countryside, the results of the winter were clear.
The invader had been driven back far beyond the lines he had occupied a year earlier. 185,000 square miles of Russian land had been freed. And in this winter campaign of 1942, the Axis powers had lost 5,090 planes, 9,190 tanks, 20,360 guns, 30,705 machine guns, more than 500,000 rifles, 17 million shells, 128 million cartridges, vast stores of other materials, and 1,193,525 men, of whom 800,000 were dead. That is the story to date of the German attempt to conquer Russia.
In 1941, they tried for Moscow and failed. In 1942, they tried for the Caucasus and failed. In 1943, and for as many more years as necessary, they will not only be resisted wherever their failing power strikes, but they will be attacked, and attacked by these united people of these united nations.